Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time, not to mighty battles or grand castles, but right into the very kitchens and dining halls of the Middle Ages. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You're walking through a smoky, bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something that smells vaguely of stale cabbage and unidentifiable meat. You pass by a grimy stall where a vendor is hawking what looks suspiciously like a blackened lumpy sausage. You feel a sudden pang of hunger and then a wave of nausea because you quickly realize that your modern, discerning palate and likely your stomach probably won't survive this trip. Seriously, what these folks considered a good meal might make your digestive system stage a full-scale revolt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a rather cramped, dark dwelling, typical of a medieval peasant's home. The air is damp, and the only light comes from a small, sputtering fire in the hearth. The smell, you've quickly learned, is a constant companion. What immediately strikes you, if you were to peer into the humble larder, is the sheer, overwhelming presence of grain. It's everywhere, sacks of it, sheaves of it, and the ever-present, sometimes slightly mouldy, loaves of bread. You see, for the vast majority of medieval society, especially the serfs and common folk, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. It was the backbone, the filler, the utensil, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and gnawing hunger. Imagine your daily life revolving around the harvest. From dawn till dusk, you're toiling in the fields, your hands calloused, your back aching. And what fuels this relentless labor? Most likely it's a coarse, dark loaf of bread, probably made from rye or barley, perhaps mixed with a bit of oats. This isn't your artisanal sourdough or fluffy white sliced bread. Oh no, this is heavy, dense, and often quite tough. It's designed to fill you up and stay with you, providing the slow release energy needed for a day of backbreaking work. It's often baked in communal ovens, a social ritual in itself, where everyone brings their dough and waits for their turn. This shared baking process was a huge part of community life, a place where gossip was exchanged and friendships forged, all centered around the creation of this vital foodstuff. One of the more fascinating and frankly a bit disturbing quirks of medieval bread was its occasional role beyond mere sustenance. You might find yourself eating a trencher. No, not a trench of bread, but a trencher, which was literally a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your meager stew or vegetables onto it, letting the bread soak up the juices, and then, when you were done, you'd either eat the soggy trencher or more often give it to your dog or the poor. Talk about zero waste. It's an ingenious, if not entirely appetizing, solution to the lack of proper dinnerware. And historians still argue whether the primary reason for trenchers was truly economic saving on pottery, if it was a deliberate culinary choice to enhance the meal's flavors. The sheer volume of grain consumed was staggering. An average medieval person might consume several pounds of bread a day. Think about that for a second. That's a lot of carbs, even for someone doing intense manual labor. And while wheat was preferred, especially for the more affluent, it was often too expensive for the common person. So rye, barley, and oats became the staples, sometimes mixed with legumes like peas or beans to stretch the flour further. The quality of your bread was often a direct indicator of your social standing. The finer, whiter bread made from sifted wheat flour was reserved for the nobility and the clergy, a symbol of their elevated status. Your bread, my friend, is probably a dark, hearty, and somewhat gritty affair, full of bran and whatever other bits snuck in during the milling process. You might even find the occasional pebble or insect, adding an unexpected crunch. Just a little extra protein, right? This focus on grain meant that agricultural failures, like a bad harvest, were utterly catastrophic. Without the grain, there was no bread, and without bread, there was widespread famine. You can imagine the constant anxiety that must have permeated medieval life. knowing that your very survival hinged on the whims of the weather and the fertility of the land. It made every harvest a moment of profound relief, a temporary reprieve from the ever-present threat of starvation. And yet, despite the simplicity, this reliance on bread fostered a deep connection to the land and the cycles of nature, a connection we've largely lost in our modern world of endless supermarket aisles. As your journey through time continues, shifting from the medieval peasant's humble kitchen, you suddenly find yourself standing before something entirely different. The scent of wood smoke gives way to the faint metallic tang of coal smoke, and the rough textures of homespun cloth are replaced by the rigid lines of brick and sash windows. You are no longer in the Middle Ages, but standing directly in front of a Victorian house, probably around the late 19th century. And let me tell you, you probably won't last 24 hours here without some serious adjustment. This isn't just a house. It's a meticulously crafted, often highly inconvenient, fortress of social expectation and hidden labor. Your initial impression is one of imposing grandeur, or perhaps a bit of overwhelming gloom. These houses, especially the larger ones, weren't designed for a quick dash in and out. They are tall, narrow, and often adorned with a dizzying array of architectural details, elaborate gables, decorative brickwork, bay windows, and perhaps even a turret or two. The exterior immediately signals the owner's status and aspiration. You notice the heavy ornate front door, perhaps made of dark polished wood with stained glass panels, intimidatingly solid. There's a distinct lack of the bright, airy spaces you're accustomed to. Instead, the windows seem to peer out like watchful eyes, often shrouded by heavy curtains from within. Stepping closer, you'd notice the distinct chill in the air, even on a sunny day. Victorian houses, while grand, were notoriously drafty. Heating was a constant uphill battle, which we'll delve into later. For now, just imagine that subtle, pervasive cold seeping into your bones from the moment you approach the doorstep. And forget about a simple doorbell. You're more likely to find a heavy brass knocker, requiring a firm rap that echoes through the silence. This immediate tactile experience sets the tone. Everything here requires effort. A mainstream historical fact about these houses is their sheer density of construction in urban areas. The Victorian era saw an explosion in population and rapid urbanization, leading to row upon row of these houses being built quickly, often side by side, creating dense, imposing streetscapes. This rapid development, however, didn't always translate to quality. While the facades could be grand, the internal construction, especially in spec-built houses, could sometimes be less than stellar, leading to issues with damp and ventilation. This mass construction is a key part of their lasting legacy, forming the backbone of many older British and American cities. A rather quirky tidbit you might observe is the distinct lack of a front garden, or at least a very small one. Unlike modern suburban homes with sprawling lawns, many Victorian houses, especially in towns, opened directly onto the street or had only a tiny enclosed patch. This was partly due to space constraints in dense urban environments, but it also reflects a different attitude to privacy and communal space. Your outdoor interactions would be less about casual front yard chats and more about formal calls or hurried errands. Historians still argue whether the preference for small, enclosed gardens or direct street access was primarily a reflection of land cost, a desire for urban efficiency, or a subtle statement about social status and privacy preferences. As you contemplate the exterior, you realize that the Victorians were masters of facade. What looks grand and solid on the outside often concealed a world of hidden labor and less than ideal living conditions within. The house itself wasn't just a dwelling. It was a complex machine, constantly demanding attention, fuel, and human effort to simply function. No smart home features here, no app-controlled thermostat. Every window, every door, every inch of brickwork was a testament to manual upkeep. The very color palette of these houses often leaned towards muted, earthy tones, dark reds, browns, greens, and greys, reflecting the industrial soot and the prevailing aesthetic. Bright, cheerful colors were often reserved for interiors, if at all. So standing here, facing this imposing structure, you feel a distinct sense of stepping back into a different time. A time where comfort was defined differently and where every aspect of the home was a reflection of the rigid social order and tireless domestic effort required to maintain it. Stepping through that imposing front door, you are immediately enveloped by the atmosphere of a Victorian entrance hall. Forget the cozy, inviting foyers of modern homes. This space was designed for grandeur, for statement, and often for making a visitor feel distinctly out of place. It was a liminal zone, a buffer between the dirty, chaotic outside world and the ordered, private interior. And quite frankly, it's probably colder than outside. Imagine the sheer scale. High ceilings, perhaps with intricate plasterwork, and a long, narrow layout stretching deep into the house. The walls would likely be papered in dark, rich patterns, flocked wallpaper with intricate floral or geometric designs, perhaps in deep greens, burgundies or blues, designed to impress and absorb the abundant coal dust. The air is still heavy and carries a faint scent of polish, damp, and perhaps the lingering aroma of yesterday's cooking drifting from the distant kitchen. The floor is likely tiled, often in a striking black and white or geometric pattern, adding to the formality and echoing chill. And that chill is very real. These grand spaces were incredibly difficult to heat. There might be a decorative radiator tucked away, or perhaps a small unlit fireplace, but their primary purpose was often aesthetic, not warm. You immediately feel a pervasive dampness, a cold that seems to seep into your very bones, making you shiver despite your modern clothing. This isn't a place for lingering, and that's precisely the point. Visitors were often kept here, or in a specific parlor, not invited deeper into the family's private realm without explicit invitation. A mainstream historical fact about these halls is their critical role in social calls and visits. A caller would arrive, hand their card to a servant, if the household was grand enough to have one, and await instruction. This wasn't a casual drop-in, it was a formal ritual, and the hall served as the stage for this delicate dance of social hierarchy. The time spent waiting here, perhaps seated on a stiff, uncomfortable bench, was part of the unspoken communication of status. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit, the common presence of a hall stand. This wasn't just a convenient place for coats and hats. It was a highly elaborate, often imposing piece of furniture, usually made of dark, heavy wood, adorned with mirrors, hooks, and sometimes even a drip tray for umbrellas. It was a functional piece, yes, but also a showpiece, hinting at the wealth and social connections of the family through the coats and hats of important visitors. Imagine the sheer weight and immovable nature of these pieces. They practically felt like another piece of architecture. Historians still argue whether the hall stand's prominence was purely practical for urban living, a symbol of domestic order, or a subtle display of social traffic and connections. As you stand there, you notice the lack of bright, direct lighting. Gas lamps, or later, early electric fixtures would have provided a dim, yellowish glow, casting long shadows and making the space feel even more enclosed. Natural light, if any, would struggle to penetrate the heavy window treatments. This dimness adds to the formal, slightly somber atmosphere a deliberate contrast to the perceived vulgarity of excessive light. The entrance hall also served as a practical hub for the household's daily comings and goings. Servants would bustle through, carrying coal scuttles, delivering messages, or answering the incessant calls of the family from upstairs. You might catch a glimpse of a hidden staircase, usually narrower and less adorned, reserved exclusively for the domestic staff, keeping their industrious efforts out of sight from the genteel front of the house. This physical separation of social classes was a fundamental aspect of Victorian living, designed to maintain strict boundaries. So, as you linger in this grand, yet undeniably chilly and unwelcoming space, you begin to understand that a Victorian house wasn't just a shelter. It was a highly organized machine for living, a rigid stage for social performance, where even the entrance hall played a crucial role in defining roles and setting expectations. And you're starting to feel just how much effort it would take to simply exist here. 4. Leaving the formal, chilly expanse of the entrance hall, you are now ushered into what was arguably the heart of Victorian social life. The drawing room. If the hall was about making an entrance, the drawing room was about making a statement, specifically, a statement of wealth, good taste, by Victorian standards anyway, and rigid social adherence, prepare yourself for an assault on your modern minimalist sensibilities, because this room is where clutter reigns supreme. Imagine stepping into a space overflowing with furniture, textiles, and decorative objects. Every surface, it seems, is covered. Heavy velvet or brocade curtains, often tied back with elaborate tassels, block much of the natural light, contributing to the pervasive dimness. The wallpaper might be even more intricate than in the hall, perhaps in rich patterns of dark red, forest green, or deep blue, often flocked to create a luxurious textured feel. Every available inch of wall space might be adorned with framed pictures, mirrors, or decorative plates. You look around and immediately feel a sense of claustrophobia. There's a profusion of overstuffed sofas and chairs, all upholstered in heavy fabrics like horsehair or plush velvet, often with intricately carved wooden frames. Ottoman poufs, occasional tables laden with bric-a-brac, and perhaps a grand piano take up almost every available floor space. Moving around without bumping into something feels like navigating an obstacle course. This isn't a room for casual lounging. It's a room for formal conversations, for receiving guests, and for demonstrating one's material prosperity. A mainstream historical fact about the drawing room is its very name. Drawing room comes from withdrawing room, a place where the ladies of the house would withdraw to after dinner, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars in the dining room. This highlights the strict gendered separation that defined much of Victorian social interaction, with distinct spaces designated for different activities and different sexes. It was a clear physical manifestation of their societal norm. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit, the obsession with fern fever, or pteridumania. Victorians, particularly ladies, became utterly captivated by ferns, collecting them, cultivating them, and displaying them everywhere. You would find ferns in elaborate fern stands under glass domes, terrariums, pressed into albums, or even decorating wallpaper in fabrics. This seemingly harmless botanical craze led to expeditions to collect rare specimens and even contributed to the development of early terrariums. Imagine trying to keep dozens of ferns alive in a drafty, gaslit room. Historians still argue whether this fern craze was a genuine scientific interest, a fashionable hobby for idle hands, or a subtle rebellion against restrictive gender roles by allowing women to engage in scientific pursuits. From the stifling formality of the drawing room, your journey through the Victorian house now leads you into a place of both fascinating complexity and considerable discomfort. The dining room. This wasn't merely a place to eat, it was a theatre for elaborate meals, a stage for strict etiquette, and a powerful symbol of the family's social standing. If you thought the drawing room was an exercise in decorum, buckle up, because dinner was an even more rigid affair. Imagine a long, heavy dining table, polished to a high sheen, often surrounded by equally heavy, high-backed chairs upholstered in leather or velvet. The walls might be panelled in dark wood or covered in rich, perhaps even embossed wallpaper. A large sideboard or credenza would display the family's finest silver and china, showcasing their wealth even before a single dish was served. The lighting, usually gasoliers hanging from the ceiling, cast a warm but often dim glow, adding to the room's formal atmosphere. This wasn't a casual chat over a pizza kind of space. Dinner, especially for the middle and upper classes, was a highly structured event. Forget serving yourself, everything was served by staff. Plates were brought in and removed. Dishes were carved at the sideboard or by the host, and vegetables were presented in separate bowls. This was a progression of courses, often many of them, from soup to fish, roasts, game, puddings, and savouries, each with its own specific serving implements and protocols. You'd be expected to know which fork to use for which course, a bewildering array of cutlery often laid out in advance, sometimes causing considerable anxiety for those unfamiliar with the dizzying rules. A mainstream historical fact about Victorian dining is the shift from service à la française, all dishes on the table at once, to service à la russe, dishes served sequentially, one course at a time. This change, which gained popularity throughout the 19th century, made dining even more formal and required a larger, more coordinated staff to execute seamlessly. It transformed dinner into a carefully orchestrated performance, enhancing the host's control and display of wealth. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about Victorian dining, the intense focus on dinner conversation. While today we might value lively, free-flowing chat, Victorian dinner conversation was often a carefully managed affair. Guests were expected to engage in polite, non-controversial topics, avoiding anything too personal, political, or scandalous. The host or hostess might even subtly direct the conversation, ensuring it remained decorous. Imagine having to maintain witty, yet entirely superficial, banter for hours. It makes you long for a casual night in with your phone, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether this rigid conversational etiquette was primarily a tool for social control, a reflection of prevailing moral codes, or simply a byproduct of large, formal gatherings where deep discussion was impractical. Despite the elaborate presentation, the food itself, while plentiful, could sometimes be surprisingly bland or overcooked by modern standards. Roasts were often cooked well done, and vegetables boiled until soft. Spices, though available, were used differently than in previous eras, often to enhance natural flavors rather than mask them, as in medieval times. Rich sauces and gravies were common, adding flavor and calories. And while quantities were vast, food waste was also significant, particularly in larger households with less careful management. The temperature of the room would again be a factor. While a fire might roar in the fireplace, the sheer volume of space, combined with the need to keep food hot through multiple courses, meant that drafts could still be an issue. You'd probably find yourself shifting in your seat, trying to find a warmer spot. As the meal progressed, you'd likely observe the strict separation of gender after the main course, with ladies withdrawing to the drawing room, while gentlemen remained at the table for port, cigars, and more robust conversation. This continued the theme of defined spaces and roles within the Victorian home. So, as you navigate the intricate dance of a Victorian dinner, from selecting the correct fork to engaging in appropriately polite conversation, you realize that this wasn't just a meal. It was a highly formalized social event, a demonstration of wealth, adherence to strict rules, and a testament to the endless domestic labor required to maintain appearances. And you'd be counting the minutes until you could escape to something less performative. Escaping the stifling formality of the dining room, you are now transported almost abruptly into the very heart of the Victorian household's engine, the kitchen. Forget sleek countertops, gleaming appliances, and ergonomic designs. This space was a realm of relentless labor, intense heat, and often an appalling lack of what we would consider basic hygiene. If you thought the front of the house was demanding, the kitchen was where the real work and grim realities unfolded. Imagine stepping into a large, often cavernous room, typically located in the basement or at the back of the house, deliberately separated from the main living areas to keep the noise, smells, and heat from bothering the family. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke, simmering fats, and perhaps a faint whiff of drains. The walls might be bare brick or simply whitewashed, utilitarian and prone to grime. The floor, often stone or rough tiles, would be constantly damp and grimy from spills and endless scrubbing. At the center of it all is the massive range, a cast iron behemoth that was the engine of the Victorian kitchen. This wasn't just a stove, it was a beast, requiring constant fueling with coal or wood to maintain heat for cooking, heating water, and often heating parts of the house. Picture the scullery maid or kitchen maid constantly shoveling coal, emptying ash pans, and polishing the black lead to keep it gleaming. It was a Herculean task, dirty and ceaseless. Cooking surfaces were hot to the touch, and the air around the range would be stiflingly warm, a stark contrast to the often chilly rest of the house. A mainstream historical fact is that the development of the enclosed cast iron range, replacing open hearths, was a significant technological advancement of the Victorian era. It offered more controlled heat and better fuel efficiency, but it still demanded immense manual labor to operate and clean. This invention transformed kitchens from open fire pits to more organized, albeit still incredibly arduous workspaces. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit that will make you cringe, the Victorian approach to larder hygiene. Perishable foods were stored in a larder, a cool room or cupboard, often with slatted shelves, and sometimes a stone slab. However, Without refrigeration, spoilage was rampant. Meat hooks would hang carcasses, and flies were an ever-present nuisance. More disturbingly, some accounts describe the practice of storing food near unsealed drains or in close proximity to cleaning chemicals, completely unaware of the health risks. Imagine butter stored near a bucket of lye, or meat attracting flies freely. It's a vivid illustration of the pre-germ theory era. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of certain illnesses was primarily due to general poor sanitation or specifically linked to these lax food storage practices. The tools of the trade were heavy and basic: cast iron pots, copper pans requiring constant polishing, large wooden spoons, and sharp knives. Food preparation involved immense physical effort: grinding spices, churning butter, kneading dough, and chopping vegetables, all by hand. There were no food processors, no electric mixers, just brute force and elbow grease. The noise would be constant: the clatter of pots, the chopping of knives, the hissing of the range, and the occasional sharp command from the cook. The hierarchy in the kitchen was strict. At the top was the cook, a highly skilled and often temperamental figure who ruled their domain with an iron fist. Below them, a hierarchy of maids: the kitchen maid, the scullery maid, and sometimes even a stillroom maid, each with specific, grueling duties. The scullery maid, for instance, spent her days washing mountains of dishes in cold or lukewarm water, often without soap as we know it, using rough cloths. The sheer volume of washing up after a formal dinner would have been staggering. You'd quickly realize that the sparkling clean dining table and the pristine drawing room were a direct result of the unseen, ceaseless, and often unpleasant labor in the kitchen. It was a place of sweat, grime, and constant vigilance against spoilage and inefficiency. And as you try to imagine preparing even a simple meal here, you'd be longing for your modern microwave and dishwasher faster than you can say Victorian plumbing. Leaving the scorching, bustling realm of the Victorian kitchen, your journey through the house now takes you to a different kind of domain: the servants' quarters. These were the cramped, often dark, and perpetually busy spaces where the unseen army of domestic staff lived and toiled, making the elegant front of the house possible. If you think your modern living space is small, prepare for a dose of historical reality. Imagine descending a narrow, uncarpeted staircase, often hidden from the main hall, leading to the lower levels or tucked away on the topmost floor. The air here is different, less grand, more utilitarian, tinged with the scent of soap, coal dust, and perhaps a faint, lingering aroma of damp linen. These spaces were designed for function, not comfort or display. Walls might be whitewashed or simply plastered with minimal decoration. Natural light, if present, would be scarce, often coming from small, high windows. The living conditions for servants varied wildly, depending on the size and wealth of the household, but generally they were Spartan. A housemaid might share a cramped attic room with several other maids, with little more than a bed, a chest of drawers, and perhaps a washstand. Privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. The furniture would be plain, sturdy, and practical, a stark contrast to the plush adornments of the family's rooms. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep in a room shared with 3 other people, waking before dawn, knowing your day would be filled with relentless labor. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer number of domestic servants employed in Victorian households, particularly in the middle and upper classes. A typical middle-class family might employ a cook, a housemaid, and a parlour maid, while wealthier households could have dozens, including footmen, ladies' maids, valets, and grooms. This vast workforce was the engine of Victorian domestic life, allowing the leisured classes to maintain their elaborate lifestyle. Without them, the grand Victorian house simply couldn't function as it was designed. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about servant life: the strict hierarchy, even among the domestic staff. It wasn't just the servants. There was a rigid pecking order, with the butler and housekeeper at the top, wielding considerable authority, followed by the cook, lady's maid, and valet, down to the scullery maid and boot boy at the very bottom. Each had their precise duties, and social interaction between different ranks could be highly formalized. Imagine being a scullery maid, at the very bottom of the ladder, constantly under the watchful eye of the demanding cook, yearning for the day you might rise to kitchen maid. Historians still argue whether this strict hierarchy among servants fostered efficiency or created unnecessary tension and resentment within the household. The workday for a Victorian servant was incredibly long and arduous. Waking before dawn was common, often as early as 5 or 6 a.m., to light fires, prepare hot water for the family, and begin the endless cycle of cleaning and polishing. Their day might not end until 10 or 11 p.m. after the family retired, leaving them exhausted. There were few days off, and social lives were severely restricted. Their existence was largely invisible to the outside world, a life lived behind closed doors and down hidden staircases. You'd notice the constant bustle and quiet efficiency in these spaces. Servants were trained to be seen and not heard, to move swiftly and discreetly. The ringing of a bell from the family's rooms would send them scurrying, ready to fulfill any request, from bringing hot water for a bath to delivering a message. Their entire existence revolved around the needs and comforts of the family they served. So, as you stand in these Spartan, industrious quarters, you gain a profound appreciation for the invisible labor that sustained the glittering facade of Victorian society. It's a sobering reminder that the comfort of the Victorian home for the family came at the direct expense of relentless, demanding work for those who lived beneath its elegant roof. You'd certainly value your weekends and personal space after even a short stay here. Leaving the diligent, unseen world of the servants' quarters, your exploration of the Victorian house now leads you to a space that, for your modern sensibilities, might be the most challenging of all, the bedroom. Forget plush mattresses and climate control. Victorian bedrooms were often cold, cluttered, and designed more for strict propriety than for luxurious comfort as you know it. Imagine stepping into a typical Victorian bedroom. Your immediate impression might be one of overwhelming decoration. The walls are likely covered in elaborate wallpaper, perhaps in deep floral patterns or rich damasks. Heavy drapes, often matching the wallpaper, would hang at the windows, blocking out light and fresh air. The furniture would be dark, heavy wood, a massive wardrobe, a dressing table laden with brushes and bottles, and a large, often imposing bedstead, perhaps with a high headboard intricately carved. Every surface, from the bedside table to the mantelpiece, would likely be adorned with photographs in ornate frames, porcelain figurines, and other decorative knickknacks. Despite the visual richness, the physical comfort level is often surprisingly low. The mattress, filled with horsehair, straw, or flock, wall scraps, would be firm to the point of hardness. Pillows might be stiff and unyielding, and the temperature? Chances are it's chilly. Bedrooms were typically unheated for most of the night, relying on a small, rapidly cooling fireplace, or perhaps just the residual heat from the day. You'd find yourself piling on heavy quilts and blankets to stay warm, perhaps even resorting to a warming pan filled with hot coals, that quirky item used to warm the bed before getting in. A mainstream historical fact about Victorian bedrooms is the strict emphasis on modesty and propriety. Even within the privacy of the bedroom, elaborate rituals surrounded dressing and undressing. Nightgowns and dressing gowns were worn, and undergarments were extensive. Sleeping nude was practically unheard of. This pervasive sense of decorum extended even to the most private moments, highlighting the era's deep-seated moralistic values. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit, the fascination with taxidermy in bedrooms. It wasn't uncommon for Victorian homes, even bedrooms, to feature stuffed animals or birds under glass dome. Imagine waking up to the unblinking stare of a deceased squirrel or a stoic owl from your bedside table. This was seen not as morbid, but as a way to bring nature indoors, display hunting prowess, or simply as an interesting decorative curiosity. It certainly adds a unique and perhaps slightly unsettling touch to the comfort of the room. Historians still argue whether this prevalence of taxidermy was a genuine love of nature, a morbid fascination, or simply a fashionable trend reflecting Victorian scientific interest in classification. Lighting in the bedroom would be primarily from gaslight, or perhaps candles for reading, casting a soft, yellowish glow that might make the room feel cozier. than it actually was. Ventilation, however, was often poor. Windows were frequently kept closed, especially at night, due to fears of night air, believed to carry disease, or simply to keep out drafts. The air could feel stale, heavy with the scent of gas and lingering perfume. Personal hygiene in the bedroom was also quite different. There would be a washstand with a basin and pitcher for cold water brought up by a servant. Remember them? For a quick wash and brush up in the morning. A full bath would be a far less frequent and much more involved affair, usually taken in a portable tub in front of the fire, or later in a dedicated bathroom if the house was large enough. So, as you prepare to settle into your Victorian bed, surrounded by dark wood, heavy fabrics, and perhaps the unblinking eyes of a stuffed bird, you realize that comfort in this era was a concept far removed from your modern expectations. It was a place of formal rest, where even your sleep was touched by the pervasive social and moral dictates of the age. You'd probably find yourself longing for a simple, uncluttered space and a genuinely warm bed. Having spent a chilly, perhaps slightly unsettling night in a Victorian bedroom, your thoughts now naturally turn to the first necessities of the day: personal hygiene and bodily functions. This leads you to perhaps the most stark and challenging difference between your world and the Victorian one: the bathroom. Forget the sleek ceramic sanctuary you know. The Victorian bathroom, or lack thereof, was a testament to inconvenience, rudimentary technology, and an ongoing battle against waste and odor. Imagine needing to use the facilities. If you're in an earlier Victorian house or a less affluent one, there might not even be a dedicated bathroom in the modern sense. Instead, you'd be relying on a chamber pot discreetly kept under the bed or in a nightstand. This would then be emptied by a servant into a larger slop pail and eventually carried outside to a privy or cesspit. The sheer logistics of this system, especially for multiple people in a household, would be immediately apparent, not to mention the undeniable odors. Even when dedicated bathrooms began to appear in wealthier homes during the latter half of the 19th century, they were far from convenient. Picture a large, claw-footed cast-iron bathtub, often standing prominently in the middle of the room. Filling it was a monumental task. Hot water wouldn't come from a tap, but would be heated on the kitchen range, then carried in heavy pitchers by servants, often up multiple flights of stairs. A full bath was a luxury, typically taken only once a week, or perhaps twice for the very wealthy. Daily ablutions involved the aforementioned washstand, basin, and pitcher of cold water in the bedroom. A mainstream historical fact is that the widespread adoption of indoor plumbing and water closets, what we call toilets, was a defining sanitary improvement of the Victorian era, driven by public health concerns and technological advancement. However, it was a gradual process, and even early water closets were prone to blockages, leaks, and often emitted foul odors due to inadequate trap systems and ventilation. This period saw a massive shift from outdoor privies to indoor facilities, a revolution in urban living. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit related to early indoor plumbing: the earth closet. Before flush toilets became widely reliable, some Victorians experimented with an earth closet, essentially a commode that dispensed a layer of dry earth or ash after each use, intended to absorb odors and act as a deodorizer. Imagine a toilet that required a bag of dirt to operate. It's a fascinating, if short-lived, interim technology between the chamber pot and the modern flush toilet. Historians still argue whether the earth closet was truly an effective sanitary solution or merely a symbolic gesture of cleanliness in an era grappling with waste management. Waste disposal, even with early indoor plumbing, was a significant challenge. Drains were often poorly designed, leading to blockages and the accumulation of waste, which in turn emitted miasma, the foul air believed to cause disease. The concept of germ theory was still developing, so the true link between sanitation and illness was poorly understood, leading to many unsanitary practices by modern standards. The lack of central heating meant bathrooms could be incredibly cold, especially in winter. Imagine stripping down for a cold sponge bath in a room where your breath might be visible. The comfort level, or rather discomfort level, would be palpable, and privacy, in the modern sense, was also different. While the act itself was private, the system required constant servant involvement, fetching and carrying water, emptying pots, maintaining the outdoor privy. So, as you contemplate the logistics of your morning routine in a Victorian house, from the chamber pot to the heavy bath, you realize that even the most basic bodily functions required significant planning, effort, and often the silent labor of others. It's a stark reminder of how recent and revolutionary our modern sanitary conveniences truly are, and you'd find yourself longing for the simple flush of a button. Emerging from the chilly, rudimentary world of the Victorian bathroom, your attention now turns to the pervasive discomforts and ingenious, if often dangerous, solutions that define daily life, heating and lighting. Forget your central heating and flick of a switch illumination. A Victorian house was a constant battle against the dark and the cold, demanding immense labor and presenting inherent risks. Imagine waking on a crisp Victorian morning. Your bedroom, as you've discovered, is likely freezing. Your first requirement is warmth. This means relying almost entirely on coal fires. Every room with a fireplace, which was most of the principal rooms, would require a fire to be lit daily, often before dawn by a scullery maid or housemaid. Picture the arduous process. Carrying heavy coals scuttles up flights of stairs, laying kindling, lighting the fire, and then constantly tending it throughout the day to keep the room from plummeting back into an icy chill. The air would be filled with the subtle scent of coal smoke, and grime would inevitably settle on every surface. Maintaining these fires was a relentless chore. Ashes had to be regularly cleared, grates cleaned, and fireplaces swept. This wasn't just about warmth, it was about status. A roaring fire in the drawing room signaled a prosperous, well-run household. But for you, the constant effort and inevitable dirt would be a shock, and the heat, when it came, was localized and inconsistent, with one side of your body toasting while the other remained chilled. A mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era saw an unprecedented increase in coal consumption, fueled by industrialization and the widespread use of coal fires for domestic heating and cooking. This reliance on coal led to severe air pollution in cities, creating the infamous pea super fogs that regularly blanketed urban centers, a direct consequence of their heating methods. You might find yourself coughing more than usual. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit related to lighting, the prevalence of gas lighting. While candles and oil lamps were still used, especially in poorer households or less frequented rooms, gas lighting became increasingly common in Victorian homes during the latter half of the 19th century. Imagine the constant hiss of the gas jets, the yellowish flickering light that cast long dancing shadows, and the need to light each jet individually with a taper. More alarmingly, gas leaks were a constant danger, leading to headaches, asphyxiation, and explosion. You'd be acutely aware of the faint, sweetish smell of unburnt gas, a constant low-level threat. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of gaslight, brighter than candles, less labor than oil lamps, truly outweighed its inherent dangers and unpleasant byproducts, or if it was simply a symbol of technological progress and modernity. The absence of central heating and electric lighting meant that tasks that are trivial to you now were monumental efforts then. Simple things like getting dressed in a warm room, reading after dark without straining your eyes, or enjoying a consistently comfortable temperature were luxuries hard won through labor and expense. Nighttime was genuinely dark, streetlights were rudimentary, and houses, once the gas was turned down or fires banked, plunged into near-total blackness, broken only by moonlight or a stray candle flame. This deep darkness contributed to a different sense of time and security, or lack thereof. Even the simple act of going to bed involved rituals centered around warmth and light. Hot water bottles might be used to warm sheets, and a chamber pot would be a necessary convenience to avoid venturing out into the cold, dark house. The concept of energy efficiency simply didn't exist. It was about brute force warmth and light, regardless of the cost in coal, gas, or human effort. So, as you try to read by the dim glow of a gas lamp or shiver as the fire dies down, you gain a profound appreciation for the invisible infrastructure of warmth and light that underpins your modern life. The Victorian house, for all its grandeur, was a cold, smoky, and often dimly lit environment, constantly demanding attention to keep its occupants comfortable, or at least not entirely frozen. You'd likely develop a newfound respect for thermostat controls and light switches. Stepping away from the dim, coal-scented realm of Victorian heating and lighting, your attention is now drawn to perhaps the most visible and certainly the most restrictive aspect of daily life: dress and undress. Forget your comfortable jeans and t-shirts. Living in a Victorian house meant being encased in layers, corsets, and intricate fastenings, a sartorial prison that dictated movement, posture, and a significant portion of your daily routine. Imagine starting your day. For a woman, the process of getting dressed was a monumental undertaking, often requiring the assistance of a maid. You wouldn't just slip into an outfit. You'd begin with multiple layers of undergarments, a chemise, drawers, stockings, and then the infamous corset. This isn't just a quaint historical garment. It was a rigid, often bone-laced structure designed to cinch the waist, push up the bust, and create the desired hourglass silhouette. Lacing a corset too tightly could restrict breathing, cause indigestion, and even deform internal organs. Imagine trying to take a deep, satisfying breath while your ribs are being squeezed. Over the corset came petticoats, sometimes several of them, made of stiffened fabrics or even horsehair, to create the fashionable bell shape of skirts. Then came the dress itself, with its voluminous skirts, often adorned with ruffles, trims, and intricate fastenings. For a woman, simply getting dressed could take an hour or more, transforming her into a walking architectural marvel. You'd find yourself frustrated by the sheer weight and bulk of the clothing, the limited range of motion, and the constant awareness of your constricted waist. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian fashion, particularly for women, emphasized modesty, elaborate layering, and a highly defined silhouette achieved through undergarments like the crinoline and later the bustle. These garments were not just about aesthetics. They were physical manifestations of the era's social norms, signaling status, gender roles, and decorum. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about men's fashion, the ubiquitous top hat. While women's clothing was complex, men's attire was no less rigid. A gentleman's wardrobe would include multiple suits, formal wear, and importantly, various hats. The top hat, in particular, was a symbol of status and formality, worn for almost all outdoor occasions and many indoor ones. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded street or even a tight hallway while maintaining the perfect angle of your towering hat. It was both a sartorial statement and a practical nuisance. Historians still argue whether the extreme formality of men's Victorian attire, particularly the uncomfortable stiffness of collars and heavy fabrics, was a symbol of seriousness and respectability, or simply a deeply ingrained cultural habit. Undressing was similarly involved. The unwinding of laces, the shedding of layers, the careful hanging of garments to avoid creases, it was a ritual in reverse. There was no concept of loungewear as you know it. Even nightwear was formal by modern standards, with elaborate nightgowns and caps. You wouldn't just flop onto your bed in your underwear after a long day. You'd perform a precise routine. The materials themselves were heavy: thick wools, velvets, silks, and cottons, often lined for warmth or structure. Cleaning these garments was a huge chore, involving hand washing, scrubbing, and often dangerous dry cleaning methods using flammable chemicals like benzene. This meant clothes were worn multiple times before cleaning, relying on airing and brushing to maintain a semblance of freshness. The impact of this clothing on daily activities was profound. Sitting elegantly, walking without tripping over voluminous skirts, or performing any kind of physical labor in such attire would be incredibly challenging. Even something as simple as running to catch a carriage would be a comical, if not painful, impossibility. Your modern freedom of movement, your ability to simply move, would feel like an astonishing luxury. So, as you struggle with invisible laces and layers, feeling the rigid confines of Victorian attire, you understand that clothing was far more than just protection from the elements. It was a social uniform, a physical discipline, and a constant restrictive presence that subtly, yet profoundly, dictated every movement and interaction in the Victorian world. You'd likely be longing for the sweet liberation of a simple pair of joggers. Having shed the constricting layers of Victorian fashion, your attention now turns to another fundamental aspect of daily existence in a Victorian house: communication. Forget instant messages, video calls, or even telephones for much of the era. Connecting with the outside world, or even with someone in the next room, was a slow, formal, and often laborious process that would test your modern patience to its limits. Imagine needing to send a message to a friend across town. There's no quick text or email. Your primary method would be letter writing. This involved pen and ink, often a quill or dip pen, prone to blots, good quality paper, and a mastery of formal prose. The letter would then need to be carefully folded and sealed and then posted. This meant either walking to a local post office or relying on the postal service, which, while increasingly efficient, still involved a delivery schedule that could mean days, not seconds, for a reply. The entire process of composing, sending, and receiving a letter was a ritual, and every word was carefully chosen. For urgent messages within the same city, you might employ a messenger boy or a servant to hand deliver a note. Imagine the frantic rush of sending a child across town with a sealed envelope, hoping they deliver it quickly and correctly. This manual, person-to-person delivery system was the closest thing to instant communication, highlighting the physical labor involved in transmitting information. A mainstream historical fact is the invention and gradual widespread adoption of the penny post in the UK from 1840. This made sending letters affordable for everyone, revolutionizing communication and vastly increasing literacy and correspondence. Before this, postage was often paid by the recipient and varied by distance, making letter writing a luxury. The penny post fundamentally changed the social fabric, allowing families to stay connected and businesses to expand more easily, but it still operated on a timescale vastly different from ours. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about Victorian communication, the speaking tube. In larger, wealthier Victorian houses, especially those with multiple floors, you might find speaking tubes installed. These were literal tubes running through the walls, from a mouthpiece in one room to an earpiece in another, often the kitchen or butler's pantry. To communicate, you'd blow into the tube to get attention, then speak into it, hoping the sound carried clearly. Imagine trying to explain complex instructions through a long, echo-prone pipe. It was an ingenious, if somewhat comical, early attempt at interroom communication before the advent of the internal telephone. Historians still argue whether speaking tubes were truly efficient or primarily a novelty that reinforced the master-servant dynamic by providing a direct, disembodied voice of command. Communication within the house itself was also different. There were no intercoms. To summon a servant, you'd pull a bell cord, activating a complex system of wires that would ring a specific bell in the servant's quarters, indicating which room required attention. Imagine the constant jangling of bells as the family went about their day, each ring a silent command to the unseen star. This system maintained the strict hierarchy and allowed the family to remain largely undisturbed by the mechanics of the household. The telephone, while invented in 1876, was a luxury and a rarity for most of the Victorian era, only gradually becoming common in the very late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, for the vast majority of your Victorian experience, you'd be without it. News, too, travelled slowly. Newspapers were a vital source, but they were published daily or weekly, meaning events in distant lands could take weeks or even months to reach you. So, as you draft a careful letter by candlelight, waiting for the clatter of a passing postal delivery, you begin to appreciate the lightning-fast, effortless communication that defines your modern life. The Victorian world demanded patience, formality, and a reliance on physical methods to connect, turning every simple message into a deliberate, sometimes arduous act. You'd likely find yourself feeling profoundly disconnected from your usual digital world. Having explored the laborious world of Victorian communication, your journey now guides you to a much more precarious and unsettling aspect of daily life in a Victorian house: health and medicine. Forget your sterile hospitals, advanced diagnostics, and readily available pharmaceuticals. Illness in the Victorian era was a constant threat, and remedies were often ineffective, unpleasant, and sometimes downright dangerous. You'd quickly realize your modern medical knowledge wouldn't do you much good here, and might even get you into trouble. Imagine feeling unwell, perhaps a persistent cough, a fever, or a stomach complaint. Your first port of call might be a family member, who would likely administer a home remedy based on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. These could range from soothing herbal teas to alarming concoctions involving various tinctures and poultices. Many of these would taste utterly dreadful, and some might even contain dangerous ingredients. There was no concept of a drugstore as you know it, filled with precisely measured, scientifically developed medicines. If your ailment persisted, you might call upon a local doctor. However, these practitioners had a far more limited understanding of disease than modern physicians. Germ theory was still in its infancy, and practices that seem barbaric today were commonplace. Bloodletting, purgatives, to induce vomiting or diarrhea, and various powerful, often addictive tonics were common treatments. An examination might involve little more than listening to your chest and inspecting your tongue. Diagnosis was often guesswork, and treatments were frequently symptomatic rather than curative. A mainstream historical fact that dramatically underscores this point is the rampant spread of infectious diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid, especially in urban areas. Poor sanitation, overcrowding, and a lack of effective treatments meant that these diseases regularly swept through populations, claiming countless lives. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was a particularly devastating and widespread killer throughout the Victorian era, often leading to a slow, debilitating decline. You might notice the persistent coughs and pale complexions of many individuals, a grim reality of the time. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit related to Victorian medicine, the popularity of patent medicines. These were widely advertised, often highly speculative concoctions sold without regulation or scientific proof of efficacy. Many contained alarming ingredients, including opium, morphine, cocaine, and large amounts of alcohol, promising cures for everything from female complaints to nervous stability. Imagine taking a soothing syrup that was essentially a dose of opiates, unwittingly becoming addicted. It was a thriving, yet ethically dubious, industry that exploited public desperation for health. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of patent medicines was a testament to effective marketing, a desperate search for comfort in an age of limited medical options, or simply a reflection of widespread addiction masked as medicine. Childbirth was another extremely perilous event for Victorian women, with high rates of maternal and infant mortality due to infection, lack of antiseptic practices, and limited understanding of complications. Even seemingly minor injuries or infections could turn deadly in an era without antibiotics. A cut that you'd brush off today could lead to a fatal infection. The air in the house itself could contribute to ill health. Drafts from inefficient windows, the pervasive dust and soot from coal fires, and the lingering odors from inadequate plumbing all created an environment that was far from sterile. You might find yourself more prone to respiratory ailments or general malaise simply by existing within these conditions. So, as you feel a scratch in your throat or a twinge in your stomach, you realize with a shiver that your usual trips to the doctor or pharmacy are utterly impossible here. You'd be at the mercy of crude remedies, limited medical understanding, and a constant underlying fear of illness. It's a stark reminder of the fragile nature of health in an age before modern medicine, making you profoundly grateful for every aspirin and antiseptic wipe. Having navigated the perilous landscape of Victorian health, your final immersion into the realities of a Victorian house brings you face to face with perhaps its most defining, yet often invisible, characteristic: social expectation. Forget the fluid social dynamics of your time. Victorian society was a rigid, intricate web of unspoken rules, class distinctions, and prescribed behaviors that dictated almost every aspect of life within and outside the home. You'd quickly realize that your survival here isn't just about physical comfort, but about navigating an invisible minefield of social norm. Imagine every interaction, every gesture, every word being weighed against an unwritten code of conduct. Your social standing, determined by birth, wealth, and profession, dictated your place in society, and thus your place within the Victorian house. From the separate entrances for tradesmen and family, to the clear hierarchy of servants, to the rigid seating arrangements at dinner, the house was a physical manifestation of the class system. You'd feel the weight of these expectations pressing down on you, constantly reminding you of your perceived position. Propriety and decorum were paramount. Public displays of emotion were frowned upon. Gentlemen were expected to be stoic and rational, ladies delicate and modest. Even within the home, a certain formality was maintained, especially when guests were present. Casual lounging, loud laughter, or overly familiar gestures would be considered vulgar. Imagine having to constantly monitor your behavior, ensuring you always presented a respectable front, even in what you might consider private moments. A mainstream historical fact that perfectly illustrates this is the concept of calling cards. These small, elegantly printed cards were essential for social etiquette, used for formal visits, expressing condolences, or making introduction. Leaving a calling card at someone's house, and the subsequent rituals of receiving one back or not, communicated complex social messages about acceptance, status, and availability. It was a silent, yet powerful, language of social interaction, and mastering its nuances was crucial for social navigation. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about Victorian social expectations, the intense scrutiny of a woman's reputation. For a respectable Victorian woman, her reputation was her most valuable asset, and it could be irrevocably damaged by even the slightest perceived impropriety. A whispered rumor, an unchaperoned meeting, or a breach of social decorum could lead to ostracization. This created an environment of constant vigilance and self-censorship, making even seemingly innocent actions fraught with social risk. Imagine living under such constant, invisible judgment. Historians still argue whether this obsession with female reputation was primarily a tool of patriarchal control, a genuine attempt to maintain moral order, or a byproduct of a society grappling with rapid social change and the anxieties it produced. Leisure time, too, was governed by social expectations. While the wealthy had more leisure, it was often structured and improving, reading, playing musical instruments, engaging in needlework, or formal social gathering. Idleness or frivolous pursuits were frowned upon. Even activities like riding or walking had specific etiquette and attire. For the working classes, leisure was scarce and often restricted to public houses or parks, but still subject to societal scrutiny. The Victorian house itself reinforced these rules. The clearly defined rooms for specific purposes, the drawing room for entertaining, the dining room for formal meals, the separate servants' quarters, physically separated different aspects of life, ensuring that each activity conformed to its prescribed social role. The entire domestic environment was a carefully managed stage for upholding appearances and reinforcing the prevailing social order. So as you attempt to navigate conversations, behave appropriately, and simply exist within this intricate web of unwritten laws, you realize that a Victorian house wasn't just a place of physical discomfort, it was a psychological arena demanding constant adherence to a complex social code. Your freedom of expression and casual demeanor would be utterly out of place, making you profoundly grateful for the comparative liberation of modern social interactions. You'd be exhausted just trying to be polite after navigating the intricate, often stifling, world of Victorian social expectations. Your journey through this rigid and fascinating era now reaches its natural conclusion. As the heavy mahogany doors of the Victorian house slowly close behind you, you are left to reflect on the profound differences between your modern existence and daily life within those ornate walls. This final reflection is about the departure. Modern comforts reimagined as you begin to truly appreciate the subtle, almost invisible luxuries of your own time. Imagine stepping out onto the pavement. The pervasive smell of coal smoke and damp that clung to the house slowly dissipates, replaced by the cleaner, crisper air you're accustomed to. The muffled sounds of the house, the distant clang of pots, the faint jingle of servant bells, the creak of floorboards, are replaced by the familiar hum of electric lights, the distant murmur of traffic, and perhaps the faint, comforting whir of an air conditioner. Your senses, dulled by the Victorian gloom and scents, slowly reawaken to the clarity of the present. The first thing you'd likely notice is the effortless comfort of your own clothing. No corsets, no layers of restrictive petticoats, just the soft, flexible fabric of your modern attire. You can breathe deeply, move freely, and sprawl out without a thought for decorum or the integrity of your garment. This simple physical freedom, so utterly absent in the Victorian era, now feels like an astonishing luxury, a liberation you've always taken for granted. A mainstream historical fact that becomes strikingly apparent upon your return is the revolution in personal hygiene and sanitation. The immediate access to clean running hot water from a tap, the flush of a modern toilet, and the sheer abundance of soap and antiseptic products are not just conveniences. They are foundational pillars of modern health that entirely mitigate the constant threats of illness and pervasive odors of the Victorian world. Your bathroom, once a primitive chamber pot or a labor-intensive chore, is now a sanctuary of effortless cleanliness. Now, for a rather quirky reimagining, consider your refrigerator, that humming box in your kitchen. Constantly keeping your food fresh and safe is a marvel that renders almost all of the medieval and early Victorian food preservation techniques entirely obsolete. No more salting, drying, or worrying about spoilage within day. Your access to fresh produce year-round, regardless of season or locality, is a direct counterpoint to the feast and famine cycles of the past. Imagine the sheer mental burden lifted, knowing your food won't suddenly go bad overnight. Historians still debate which single invention had the most profound impact on daily domestic life. Was it reliable electricity, the flush toilet, or refrigeration? Each transformed existence in unique, fundamental ways. Your modern home, even a small apartment, feels expansive by comparison to the cluttered, multi-purpose rooms of the Victorian era. The very concept of empty space, of minimalist design, would be utterly alien to them. The consistent, effortless warmth from your central heating or the cool breeze from your air conditioning completely eradicates the physical discomfort of drafts, soot, and inconsistent temperatures. Light, at the flick of a switch, banishes shadows and gloom instantly. And communication. Your smartphone, that small device in your pocket, embodies a level of instantaneous global connection that would have been unimaginable, almost magical, to a Victorian person. The ability to speak to someone across the world in real time, to access vast amounts of information in seconds, or to share your life with friends and family instantly highlights the profound shift from formal letters and laborious messenger boys. As you settle back into your comfortable chair, perhaps with a cup of hot tea made instantly from an electric kettle, you recognize that comfort is not a static concept. It's built upon layers of technological advancement and societal change that have, often silently, eliminated the relentless labor, the pervasive discomforts, and the constant anxieties of earlier eras. The Victorian house, in all its fascinating detail, serves as a powerful reminder of how far we've come, making the simple, effortless routines of your everyday life feel like extraordinary gifts.